Good morning and welcome virtually to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands and I'm director of the Canada Institute, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's discussion of President Biden's first international trip, which includes a number of summits from the G7 to a U.S. European meeting and a NATO summit as well. Joining me are a number of my outstanding Wilson Center colleagues who will frame up the meetings and expectations for this first trip. We'll begin with Dan Hamilton. Daniel Hamilton is a director of our Global Europe program and Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation Fellow, Distinguished Fellow here at the Wilson Center. After Dr. Hamilton, we will have Shihoko Goto, Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for Northeast Asia, and the Asia Program. Abe Denmark, Director of the Asia Program. Matt Rajansky, Director of the Kennan Institute. And Michael Schrage, who is Director of the Polar Institute and Director of the Global Risk and Resilience Program here at the Wilson Center. We'll move in that order. Before we get started, I also want to remind those folks in the audience that you can ask a question of today's panel in one of two ways. You could email us at GEP, that's Global Europe Program, but just the initials, GEP@wilsoncenter.org, or send us a Twitter message at Wilson Center GEP for Global Europe Program. Europe's in the lead because they have so many countries to cover. And of course, with that, I don't want to take anything away from Dan Hamilton. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to colleagues for joining today. President Biden's first international trip going to Europe, it's a cascade of summits, starting with the G7, but also NATO Summit, U.S.-EU Summit, and then the president heads to Geneva to meet with Vladimir Putin. And on the margin of those summits, there are any number of other, of course, bilateral meetings of quite significance. So if I could set the scene by riffing through those, at least the three first summits in terms of what might be expected or some of the issues are likely to be. The White House is talking about three C's: COVID, climate, and China. And they're framing some of the activities throughout these summits in that way, although with different emphases depending on the summit itself. And I think the White House is trying to project this message of renewed unity among leading like-minded democracies. It's really a political message that the United States is back. It's back with its closest partners, and together those partners are trying to shore up their democratic resilience, their unity, and to sort of move the world from sickness to health in a variety of fronts. And I think the White House is trying to convey a very positive, self-confident message. It's not about, well, China is clearly lurking there as is Russia. It's really more about the democracies themselves coming together to tackle a whole range of issues that they can't tackle on their own. I think the G7, the test will be, the G7, often issues long declarations of actions that they'll pledge to do. And if you look at them 1 year later, you sort of, how many of those were actually achieved? So I think the G7 really has to face some tests here. They already took an action just last week with the finance ministers on a minimum global tax. Whether that will see the light of the day in the end is to be seen. In the United States, that'll have to go through the Congress, but it was a significant step that will show they're working on some things. But I think the bigger test at the summit will be this point about the world moving from sickness to health. What can the G7 do practically in that space? Boris Johnson, the host, has said the summit should announce that they will mobilize the world to vaccinate the entire world by the end of 2022. That's a big statement. The question will be, is there any practical plan behind that? Or is this just, again, some hot air? So I think that'll be a big test for the G7. The second is the economic recovery, trying to move our economies from sickness to health as well. The United States is roaring ahead, 6.9% growth, the biggest in 4 decades. The other leading economies are sort of starting to re-emerge. And so there might be a more synchronized way to do this, but that'll be a big test for the G7. And there are lots of issues in the G7 basket, which I can also defer to my colleagues on. Let me turn to the more Europe-specific, transatlantic specific summits, which follow immediately after the G7. The president goes from Cornwall to Brussels for the NATO summit. Joe Biden, has called NATO a sacred duty. It's a very big contrast to Donald Trump, who questioned the alliance's relevance. So President Biden has really one single big task, which is simply to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to NATO, especially Article 5 collective defense provision, and that the United States really stands behind the alliance as it had for so many decades. And that commitment had been questioned in recent years. So it's mainly a signal of unity, a political message. And President Macron of France and others have said, if you really want to use NATO, let's use it. Let's actually use it as a political forum to discuss lots of other kinds of security relevant issues. So one question will be, will the leaders really step up in that way and say, we want to use NATO more, not only as a military alliance, but as a political forum to discuss transatlantic issues? It's uncertain whether they'll get that far, but they do have an ambitious agenda in terms of deliverables. I think one, just to note, is that military operations in Afghanistan will be coming to an end. This has been a defining feature of NATO for 2 decades. The allies all went into Afghanistan together and they're all coming out together militarily. The question would be, what's NATO's role in other ways in Afghanistan once the military operation leaves? They're likely to announce a review of the NATO strategic concept. This is NATO's guiding document. It was last written in 2010. It's way out of date. And during the past few years, the alliance leaders have been reluctant to commit to a new review because they weren't sure what the United States would say. Now I think they're right to do it. It'll be a year-long process leading to the next summit, which is likely to be in Madrid a year from now, and unveil a new way for NATO to think about the future. Deterrence and defense are going to be really critical, and especially on the burden sharing issues. It's maybe important to remember that the 2% spending goal that NATO allies agreed to some years ago was actually Obama-Biden goal. It was set during that administration. Donald Trump beat up on the allies enough to get them to move, but it was actually something started earlier. And it seems that Joe Biden will not want to backtrack from his own sort of initiative on that. So burden sharing will be important to the United States. There will be, I think, a new emphasis on what's called resilience. That is, all of the kinds of arteries that keep our free societies open are susceptible now to disruptive attack or change. You think about the malware attacks in the United States, the ransomware, but also cyber activities, hybrid. All of that is creating a new imperative for allies to think about how to become more resilient. That's a new security dimension the alliance hasn't really done as much on as it could, and I think they will be challenged to do more. Which leads to the issue of how disruptive technologies, emerging technologies, are affecting our security going forward. There is a plan to announce a sort of almost like a transatlantic DARPA, like a new advanced research projects hub accelerator to put private sector actors and militaries together to talk about the new kinds of emerging technologies. That'll be something new for NATO. The question is whether it will be resourced in terms of funding it. Another area I think that'll be a new avenue for NATO is on partnerships. NATO has many partners around the world. In fact, there are more partners than allies. And as part of the political messaging here, that NATO would want to step up and strengthen its ties with like-minded partners. including a number in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. That should cause some headlines in terms of what it will mean in terms of new ties between NATO and some countries like Japan, South Korea, maybe even India, that maybe some haven't expected. But there'll also be a focus on the neighborhood around NATO in Europe, more activities with partners like Ukraine, the Western Balkans, but I wouldn't anticipate any new action on enlargement for Ukraine or Georgia, anything beyond that. It'll be more practical, sort of low key, not pushing the enlargement agenda at this summit. Another new area for NATO is the security implications of climate change. Secretary General Stoltenberg has made a big point about this, and you'll see a new initiative here in terms of how NATO has to not only have better situational awareness of climate change, but how the militaries have to adapt. NATO forces in Iraq and Afghanistan were dealing with, all sorts of extremes of heat and weather, and militaries aren't really, having to adapt to that. So that'll be something new. And throughout the summit, China is going to figure, as is Russia. But China is something new for NATO. The most alliance leaders had dealt with China in the past with a one sentence in the last communique that China is something to sort of keep in mind. I don't think you'll see an initiative targeted at China in the NATO communique at the summit, but the whole set of actions I just mentioned are about NATO allies reaffirming their base, their unity, their political determination to work together in terms of affirming democracy, their own security, technological leadership, and this partnership with like-minded democracies around the world. The strategic concept review is likely to address the China issue over the course of this next year. So that's a full package for NATO. And then the president turns the next day, stays in Brussels to go to the U.S.-EU summit. Most of the EU members are also NATO allies, but they're not exactly the same. And the U.S.-EU relationship is more complex and difficult than the NATO relationship. The United States European EU relationship is the largest commercial relationship in the world. $5 trillion economy, 15 million jobs directly dependent on investment flows only across the Atlantic. And yet the US and the EU have always found it very hard to make that relationship strategic. It really hasn't, it always punches below its weight in terms of what it could be. This will be the first summit, US-EU, since 2014. It's been a long time. And the US and the EU have to face a whole host of challenges sort of left at the doorstep that they're not going to resolve immediately. So I think the best one can hope for the US-EU summit is what you would call maybe first actions that could be taken to restore a sense of a working partnership again. There are a host of lingering irritants in the trade front. If they could resolve the Boeing Airbus dispute, that would be a quick win. There's signs that that might happen. But the steel and aluminum tariffs across the Atlantic are still there. There's no indication they're going to go anytime soon. So that's the problem, and that holds back, a more positive agenda. The U.S. and EU are likely to announce a new Trade and Technology Council that will work not only on trade issues, but on defining standards and regulations regarding emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and other things. That's something very new. The EU had proposed it last December already. We may see maybe an announcement of opening up travel, at least for Americans to go to Europe. EU ministers have basically already took that decision, but it hasn't been formally enshrined yet. It's hard to think of Europeans coming to the United States since COVID is still really quite prevalent in Europe. But where the US and EU have at least rhetorically come together in recent months is on climate and economic growth, a green new growth type of agenda, with the Biden administration pushing that equally with EU leaders, infusing climate issues and energy transition issues into economic recovery. It's interesting, that European countries are the largest investors in the United States energy economy. And 4 of the top 5 companies in Europe with long-term renewable contracts are US companies. So we're not, either of us, going to really engage in this renewables revolution unless we do it together. The question will be with what standards and with what type of resources. There is some challenges here. The EU has already put forward some drafts of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which could potentially derail cooperation because the US is concerned about that and whether it's compatible with the WTO. So there's, even in this area, there are some challenges. On foreign policy, though, the US and the EU have come around, particularly on sanctions. They've aligned on sanctions on Russia, again, on Belarus, on China, they're on Myanmar. And so this is an area where there has been a kind of a rethinking in Europe about some of the challenges of using sanctions. There's always controversy about that, but there's been a real turn. And finally, again, China looms over this summit as well. There is in the media a lot of discussion about, the US trying to corral the Europeans into some sort of anti-China agenda of some kind. But if you look at the words of the administration, Senator Blinken, even President Biden have talked about it in ways pretty much like the Europeans do, that there are areas in which we would want to work with China as a partner. We have to do that on climate change, non-proliferation, issues related to Iran, for instance. There are areas where we agree China is a real competitor when it comes to forced technology transfer, other kinds of issues in the economy. And in some ways, China is a systemic rival, or as Secretary Blinken said, an adversary. And that has to do with its approach to the global commons, challenges to norms and standards, creating alternative institutions. And you see here a change on the margin in many European countries thinking about this. They don't want to be corralled into an anti-China front, but the mood has changed in Europe about China, and you see it in specific ways. Italy under Mario Draghi now has abandoned its participation in the Belt and Road. It was the leading EU country doing that. He has shut down Chinese acquisitions of Italian companies. The Chinese have a 17+1 initiative with Central and Eastern European countries, and Romania, Lithuania, others are starting to bail out of that. Even in Germany, you see signs of a rethinking of the sort of the Merkel approach to China, which had been more a hedging approach. This comprehensive agreement on investment the EU signed with China is basically dead on arrival. It's been frozen because of the sanctions imposed both ways. So I don't see an anti-China coalition building this way, but I do see more of an alignment across the Atlantic on how to understand the challenge of China. And all of that finally tees up the president to go to Geneva with a sort of, hopefully, he believes, strong message of unity to see Vladimir Putin. I'll leave it to Matt to take that on. So quickly, as much as possible, that's a big agenda, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan Hamilton. Now we'll turn over to Shihoko Goto.
Great, thanks, Chris. It's great to be here. And I've been asked to focus on Japan. And Japan actually is still the only Asian nation that's represented in the G7 at a time when the Indo-Pacific is really driving global growth. I should also add that Japan is also the only G7 country that's not part of NATO either. We've set the agenda for this particular panel discussion as what the first international trip for Biden means. Of course, Biden's first meeting with a foreign leader at the White House was with the Japanese Prime Minister. And for Prime Minister Suga too, this is actually his first in-person summit meeting since he came into office in September of last year. He actually came into office without going through a general election, being voted in by the people. Rather, he was simply voted as the party leader to succeed Prime Minister Abe. So he is facing a great deal of pressure ahead of the domestic elections, both to be the leader of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party and the upcoming lower house elections of Japan, which is slated to be in autumn of this year at the very latest. At the same time, Prime Minister Suga will be the host of the Summer Olympic Games at the end of July. And this, of course, has been under great scrutiny, and it's found a lot of challenges given the uncertainties about ensuring safety under the current pandemic situation. And so he really needs support from the G7, of course, to ensure that the Olympic Games go on successfully without any major additional hurdles. He also needs good optics to come out from London for the domestic audience. He also needs to establish good relations with the other G6 leaders, which his predecessor had actually been able to do quite well during his time in office for 8 years. Ahead of the meetings, Japan has done a number of things to ensure that it meets the so-called three Cs, that is to say, meeting the COVID challenge, the climate change challenge, and the China challenge as well. When it comes to dealing with the COVID situation, Japan, even though its vaccination rate has until recently been one of the lowest, if not the lowest amongst the OECD countries, it's actually been part of the at the forefront of the global effort to be engaged in vaccine diplomacy. And it's actually given vaccines to Taiwan, and it's committed giving vaccines to Vietnam as well. And it is expected to distribute more vaccines both to across Southeast Asia and to the Pacific Island nations as well. What is quite striking, though, is that Japan is not expected to take the opportunity in London to have a discussion with South Korea on the sidelines. Of course, South Korea has been invited to be part of the G7 discussions as an observer country, but it's pretty much expected that there will not be a meeting between Prime Minister Suga and President Moon Jae-in on the sidelines, even though relations between South Korea and Japan are at an all-time low, and the United States depends heavily on solid relations between Tokyo and Seoul for regional stability. It is, I believe, a lost opportunity to enhance relations between the two countries with shared regional concerns. And it's also a lost opportunity for Suga to make his mark as a far-sighted leader who really can overcome some of the short-term political hurdles and really focus on the interests of Japan's longer strategic aims and the region's strategic position vis-a-vis China as well. Now, there's been a G7 consensus on the agenda, and there's certainly, up until now, the G7 has certainly been effective in keeping the global economy from collapsing since the advent of the pandemic. Of course, since early last year, we've seen a significant disruption, to say the least, on both supply and demand sides. But aggressive domestic fiscal stimulus policies from all G7 member countries, and especially from Japan, have really helped in keeping the global economy afloat. And looking ahead, one of the significant challenges that Japan will be looking for the G7 to signal is the need to address the challenge of inclusion and sustained growth. And the question of inclusion will, of course, be about who's in and who's out of the G7 countries, and also whether the G7 agenda can actually unite the world's richest countries and resonate beyond the G7. And that can only be done really by addressing two issues in the mind of Japan. One is to address the issue of sustainable growth and fiscal health of the global economy. And secondly, to wean off over dependence on China and to reach a common ground to define what exactly that China challenge is economically, politically, and on the security front as well. As I said earlier, the G7 will include South Korea as an observer, as well as India and Australia. But it's interesting to note that since over the last 2 days, Mondays and Tuesday, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi hosted an ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in China in person. And they discussed many of the issues that the G7 will be addressing later this week, including how to recover economically and fiscally from the pandemic, and to focus on economic development in a post-pandemic world. And it's clear that Beijing is courting and providing an alternative roadmap to what will be drawn up in London later this week. And of course, Southeast Asia is looking to China for partnership, especially on the economic front, and in particular in assisting growth in growing their infrastructure and meeting some of the healthcare and other challenges posed in this under the global pandemic. Of course, the origin of the G5 and later the G7 has been to focus on the international economic agenda, and the US weakness has been that it has not been engaged economically in the Indo-Pacific. And Japan, at the end of the day, will want more engagement from both the United States as well as the European Union, the European nations economically and on the security front as well. So just to note what Biden's challenges will be as he goes on his first international trip and his first in-person G7 meeting. Of course, he will need to get congressional support for any new agreements or commitments he may make on the global stage. We've already talked a little, Dan has talked a little bit about the overhaul or the efforts to overhaul the international tax regime. There may be opportunities at the G7 to really reconsider and realign the global supply chain to make it more resilient to disruptions and external shocks. And other commitments may or may not be made in London. And the challenge, of course, will be for Biden not only to reach an agreement amongst the G7, but to be able to carry it home and have Congress approve and sign off on those agreements. And that is critical, really, because the United States really does need to regain trust from the world, not just from the leaders of the world's richest countries, but at the world at large, and a demonstration that US commitments will not be reversed. And that although Biden has this tremendous rhetoric about a commitment on the part of the White House to work together with allies to promote US values and to support low-income nations, those words, that rhetoric will actually be upheld and not simply be empty words. And then finally, to make sure that those words and actions actually align as the administration pushes for values-based diplomacy that unites like-minded countries. So when the Biden administration talks about inclusion and the allure of democracy and the strength of democracy, it is imperative to incorporate the voices and needs of all of the G7, of course, but also those that are not part of the G7 grouping. And that's especially critical in the face of China actively courting emerging markets to offer the economic support that they need for continued and sustained growth. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Shihoko. I want to remind our viewers that if you'd like to ask a question of the panel, you can do so by emailing us at GEP, Global Europe Program, that's what it stands for, just the acronym, at wilsoncenter.org, or by sending a message to our Twitter handle, which is at Wilson Center GEP. Now we turn to Abraham Denmark for another view from Asia.
Thanks, Chris. And I'm in the unenviable position of talking about Asia right after my colleague Shioka Goto talked about Asia. So I will try to be brief and additive rather than duplicative. So I'll make one comment broadly about the G7 and then talk about Asia and its role related to the G7. First, I think that this has the potential to be the most consequential meeting of the G7 since after the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Primarily because of the immense challenges that the G7 is facing and reacting to. Now, we've already talked about what's been explicitly stated, the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of China, climate change. But I think there's another challenge that the G7 is tacitly reacting to. And that is the Trump administration and other movements, populist movements counter to globalization and multilateralism that are happening in other parts of the world, especially in the G7. And I think a lot of what is happening, in addition to trying to solve the challenges that we face, is also trying to demonstrate that this approach, that multilateralism, alliances, economic integration can deliver, can produce results, and advance our interests as well as our values. So in order to achieve that, it can't just be rhetoric. There can't just be a nice statement that comes at the end of this meeting. There needs to be practical, pragmatic consequences and effects from this meeting to demonstrate that the world's advanced economies, which are also democracies, can be effective in addressing these challenges. Now, on Asia, I think it's important to note that South Korea, Australia, and India are also attending. To me, this represents the economic and geopolitical significance of the Indo-Pacific's advanced democracies. But I think we need to think about what the implications of this going forward. Is there some opportunity for institutionalization of engagement between the G7 and these other advanced Asian economies that are not part of that? And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but maintaining engagement between the traditional G7 and these other advanced Asian economies, I think, is going to be especially important going forward, especially when you're considering the broad challenges that we're facing of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the rise of China. We've also seen the Europeans getting more engaged in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific. And I think the inclusion of Asian states in the G7 is reflective of that. We've seen indications of greater cooperation among defense industries. There's recently the Japan-UK Free Trade Agreement, the CEPA, and the UK's recent successful bid to become a dialogue partner with ASEAN. All of which I think signals growing interest in Europe about Asia and growing interest in Asia about Europe. And the G7 has an important role to play, especially in the economic realm, of enhancing that cooperation. But I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. But as has been mentioned before, the G7 is not the only meeting that's happening with this trip. President Biden will also be engaging in EU and NATO summits. So I wanted to mention a bit about NATO. And it was mentioned before that there's the possibility that NATO may look to enhance its engagement with these countries, with Japan, Australia, India. But I think there's questions about what exact mechanism that would play. There's been some indication, some ideas to include India in the Partners Across the Globe mechanism that Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand are already members of. I think it may be difficult to get India into that group, mostly because Pakistan is already a partner there. But I also don't know if a broad Partners Across the Globe mechanism is what would make sense. To me, what would make more sense is a separate Indo-Pacific dialogue, similar to how there's already a NATO Mediterranean dialogue, which I think would be easier to get Indian cooperation because their concern, their focus is going to be on maintaining both the reality and the appearance of strategic autonomy, They're going to be very sensitive about maintaining a good relationship with Russia. And even with China, they will want is aligned with the United States and the West. So while I don't expect any country in Asia will be interested in joining NATO as a full partner, Japan may be interested in enhancing its security cooperation with NATO. But for countries that are less sure about these things, like India, like other countries in the Indo-Pacific, a separate dialogue may be the appropriate mechanism for this. I do not believe that NATO is the right mechanism for multilateral coordination in the Indo-Pacific, but it could be an effective way to bring the Europeans into Asia and encourage multilateral security dialogues between Europeans and the United States and our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. Last point I would make before I get into some issues of what to watch, the question of China. The G7, to my mind, appears to be being very careful about not appearing to come off as an anti-China bloc, which I think is very understandable. And we need to be careful about how we phrase these things. But if we're going to be effective in addressing the rise of China, if that is one of the main challenges that we're going to be confronting during these summits, we need to be able to accept a bit of discomfort with the Chinese and say and do things that Beijing may object to. So in terms of what to watch for, I wanted to highlight 4 pieces for the audience on what to watch for. First, I read through the statement that came out of the Foreign and Development Ministers meeting of the G7 that happened this past May. And I noted that there was a very clear statement put out about the coup in Myanmar, as well as statements about China on human rights, be it Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, but also the pressure that China's been putting on Taiwan. So I'll be looking at the joint statement that comes out of this summit to see if there are statements made about these issues, about China, about Myanmar, because I think the world, and especially Asia, is looking to the G7 not only as an economic mechanism, but also as a geopolitical mechanism. So that will be something to watch. The third piece I would look to watch would be the role of these Asian partners, whether there's some movement to institutionalize their participation, their partnership with the G7, and if we're able to go beyond that and find a way for the G7 to engage directly with ASEAN, which I think is an extremely important block of countries. Shihoko mentioned that China's been meeting with the foreign ministers. Our Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, was recently in Southeast Asia meeting with several ASEAN partners. And I think that mechanism is going to be the potential for a G7 mechanism with these major advanced Asian countries, as well as ASEAN, I think has a lot of potential. Last point I'd make is that when I speak to Asian friends, especially amongst our allies and partners, there is a loud chorus of views looking for a positive US economic agenda for the Indo-Pacific. We're not in the TPP or the CPTPP as it is now. We're not in the RCEP. So what is our economic agenda? What is our economic vision for the region that we are going to use to compete with the Chinese? I expect that this event, that the G7 summit especially, will have some elements of that, of what may become a broader vision for the economies of the Indo-Pacific. But what can we do, I think broadly, how could we use the G7 to build momentum to constructing a more positive economic agenda for the Indo-Pacific? I think, to me, is a critical question for the United States and something I'll be watching carefully as these summits progress. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abe Denmark. Now over to Matthew Rajansky for a perspective that includes Russia, the other big presence outside these summits. Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Look, my colleagues have shed a tremendous amount of light on the administration's thinking, and I think that applies every bit as much to the agenda and the context, if you will, for the meeting with Putin. There's obviously going to be a lot of media attention on this meeting. There's a lot of political weight attached to it, but I wouldn't by any means call it the central goal or the centerpiece of the trip. In fact, I don't think it is impossible. I want to put this possibility out there that something happens in the next week And that last tail end day of the agenda just doesn't happen. This relationship is deeply fraught. There are any number of risk factors around, Russian cyber intrusions in the United States, the conflict in Ukraine, the crisis in Belarus, and any number of post-Soviet countries, as well as, of course, the internal situation in Russia, the treatment of the Russian opposition, the independent press, which we've covered extensively in a recent series of Kennan Institute events. I think any of those things could potentially metastasize within the next week into the kind of crisis that would effectively make the summit pointless. But for the sake of argument, let's assume the summit's happening. If it's happening, I think the president and Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, and Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, have been crystal clear about the intent going in, which is to seek to impose some guardrails on destabilizing behavior from Moscow. There's no guarantee that that's possible, but it is guaranteed that if you are unrealistic about the nature of the system that you're dealing with, this is a one-man show. Vladimir Putin runs the Russian state out of the Kremlin. And so if the two leaders don't talk to each other, you pretty much guarantee you don't have a chance to get to those guardrails. Thinking a little bit more ambitiously, the president has talked about a more stable and predictable relationship. I think for him, that means strategic stability. It is not because he has any great love for Vladimir Putin that Joe Biden called him on day 6 of his presidency on January 26th. He did it because he recognized the importance of nuclear arms control. And it was necessary to speak directly to Putin in order to get agreement between the two countries to extend the New START arms control treaty, which they did for 5 years. But that's not the end of the story. And so if I'm looking at really two main potential deliverables from this summit, number one would be the launch of a strategic stability dialogue. That is something we've done before. Look, it was done in the Trump administration. It was certainly done in the Obama administration. But the question now is, have we reached the natural endpoint of the legacies of Cold War nuclear arms control, of which New START is really the last progeny, if you will? Is that something that we can, reanimate in some modified form for the long-term future? Or do we have to fundamentally rethink, given changes in technology and changes in geopolitics, how we do nuclear arms control? That's the central question for the strategic stability dialogue. But this is also the right forum in which to address cyber issues, which are obviously of increasing urgency, not just the question of cyber warfare, the question of what is acceptable conduct, what are acceptable boundaries between cyber espionage and cyber attacks, and what are the responsibilities of states vis-a-vis private actors, right? These ransomware attacks that we've seen over the last couple of weeks that have really crippled major American and international businesses were launched from within essentially the jurisdiction of the Russian Federation. So what is their responsibility and what are the responsibilities of other important states? And I do think, China is going to come into that conversation. The second big deliverable that I would hope for is actually pretty modest. And that's getting back to functionality, getting back to some basic infrastructural functioning in this relationship. Neither of our ambassadors is currently in their embassy. Not too many other people are in those embassies. We are facing a situation on the Russian side now where they are threatening not to allow any foreign national employees of our embassy. And the way the U.S. Embassy in Russia works is a lot of parts of it really can't function without foreign national employees because you don't have foreign service officers or other U.S. employees to do that work. So we're basically talking about, having to turn the lights off on big swaths of the relationship. And you'll all recall the tit for tat expulsions that we've seen over the last several years, certainly in the Trump administration, but even a small handful just a couple of months ago during the current administration. So, there's obviously, we've created in that sense now low-hanging fruit for rebuilding some basic functioning. You don't have to like or respect the Russian leadership in order to agree that you have to talk to them about the kinds of issues I mentioned before. And it's a lot easier to do that when you have infrastructure in place. And then finally, this is not a deliverable, but it's a topic that certainly is going to come up. And that's the human rights situation within Russia and in states that Russia leans on heavily, like Belarus. You have a much greater capability to address those problems, to be present, to keep the Russian and American people connected if you've got functioning diplomatic infrastructure, if you have embassies, if you have consulates, if you have consular officers, if you have cultural officers, and even some of the areas of the relationship we don't think much about, like agriculture. We're now facing the first time since the 1930s where we did not have an American agricultural officer in the Soviet Union or Russia. I mean, one of the world's major agricultural producers at a time when climate change is forcing us to think very seriously about those issues. I think it's very natural to pass the floor to my colleague, Mike Sprague, to talk about Arctic issues in more depth, but that's certainly going to be on the agenda. And there's a lot that I didn't cover, but I think in the interest of time, Chris, I'll leave it there.
Excellent, and I won't get in the way. On to you, Mike, for a discussion of the Arctic and beyond.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matt, for setting that up perfectly. I too will try to be brief. I know we've got a limited amount of time, but as usual, my colleague Matt has nailed two real wonderful hooks here. One is that what the administration seeks, the U.S. administration seeks here, right? Predictable, stable relationship. He talked about strategic stability dialogue, and he talked about functionality. So let me just focus perhaps then my comments on the Biden-Putin meeting in relation to the Arctic, right? We know that what's dominating the discussion right now in the press and elsewhere is this strategic competition, the militarization of the North. But if the president is looking for something to take away that perhaps both Russia and the United States have an interest in, I would say that perhaps area of cooperation would be the Arctic, right? Let's not fool ourselves. The narrative about the great competition, the power competition, militarization of the North is real. We should be vigilant and we should be diligent. But you can't militarize, you can't minimize what's happening here. But despite temperatures in the Arctic heating up environmentally 3 times the global average, perhaps through dialogue we can cool it off politically. And I would say that the leaders would do well to think about Arctic research as a place of cooperation, to go back to Matt's point about functionality and strategic stability dialogue. Look, this is not going to normalize a relationship, but we're searching for areas that you can at least agree upon and maybe cooperate. So I would say that if the US went forward with a package that brought to the forum, and it was then received well by the Russian Federation, of thinking about some kind of bilateral, multilateral, multinational Arctic research cooperative engagement, that might be one way you can turn to some functionality in the relationship, as Matt noted, right? The Russians had the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years. Their agenda includes environmental protection and climate change. Talk about indigenous peoples, the need for research and research cooperation. In fact, the Russian Federation has invited science ministers from just the 8 Arctic nations to convene in September at an Arctic Science Ministerial to identify and fund Arctic research projects that have mutual challenges, mutual opportunities. So I think this presents perhaps an opportunity for the Biden administration to advance US interests in a multinational setting, but it's a bilateral relationship as well. Again, I don't think we're going to normalize this relationship, nor do I think it's going to be at a ministerial level if in fact the US chooses to accept the invitation. But you could have leaders from the National Science Foundation, NOAA, Office of Science, Technology, Policy, to bring forward areas of Arctic research that the United States and Russia and the other 6 Arctic nations could cooperate on. There's lots to address here, and maybe that's a path towards a more normal, a more functional dialogue with the Russian Federation. Climate change is high on the agenda of this administration, so let's play to the cover here. Let's think about things that the global community needs in this globalized Arctic: more climate change research, more Arctic observing networks. The issue of permafrost thaw in the Arctic, for those who follow this, full well, not only does it have an impact on the amount of methane and carbon released into the atmosphere, but it threatens current and future infrastructure. The Russians have significant expertise here, as does the United States and the other 6 nations. Infrastructure, bridge, transportation, all in an Arctic context, could be places where the 2 countries find some equities in leveraging their expertise. The issue of black carbon, oil spill response, the issues of marine, we have a new ocean opening. We have a lot of research to do to understand further cause and effect in the Arctic. I would also say that in terms of, back to Matt's idea of functionality and strategic stability dialogues, not just because I am an Alaskan, but Alaska, Russia have a long history here. And so perhaps there is a return to some type of relationship between Chukotka and Alaska in terms of indigenous peoples, some kind of research bridge between not just the state, but the United States through Alaska. Or we have a tyranny of distance, so search and rescue, Bering Strait agreements on pollution and monitoring ship traffic already in place could be enhanced. I won't belabor the point, but I do think I do think that if both nations, especially the United States, are looking for places to actually cooperate with the Russians, like we do in the International Space Station, and trying to find a path towards some amount of productive engagement, I would argue that the Arctic may provide for us at least a few of those pathways to a more predictable and stable relationship between these two countries. Chris, I'll just leave it there.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mike. And for those of you who follow my Canada work, it's pretty clear why Canada is valuing these summits so highly. It's the place, the top table, where all of these issues, which matter very much to Canada as well, are going to be discussed. We have some questions from our viewers, and I want to direct those as quickly as possible to our experts. First, a question about the potential for the EU, the G7, and even NATO to call on both the United States and Russia to rejoin the Open Skies Agreement as a cornerstone of European security. Dan, what do you think of that potential and the larger arms control debate? And then we'll go to Matt.
Well, I think unfortunately, neither the US nor Russia now are going to rejoin the Open Skies Agreement. President Putin just made that formal, and the Biden administration, having looked at it, decided also not to go back to it. So I'm not sure that that's the next direction. Some would argue it's still very important. Others would argue technology today means you actually don't need those types of provisions to know where things are over other territories. But that's the debate. But I don't think that framework per se probably is going to see U.S. Russia coming together. Perhaps Matt might have a different view. I think the broader issue is that we're in a position where the danger of miscalculation of accidents between military forces in Europe is extremely high. Many of the provisions we had built over the years for confidence building measures have deteriorated. And there is, as Matt said, a need not only to talk about strategic stability, but to just have some mechanisms in place so militaries aren't bumping into each other, that aircraft aren't going to collide, that the ships have signals so they understand, where people are. These are the kinds of things that are very practical. I think some practical agenda like that could be some first start. That's not a favor to the other side. It's simply in your own interest. Even in Syria, where we had tremendous difficulties with Russia, the US and Russia came together on a series of provisions of at least, heading off this type of miscalculation. So if we could do that in Syria, it would seem to me we could do that in Central Europe, and maybe there's something there. The action for that is something called the Vienna document. It's actually not in NATO, it's within the framework of the OSCE. And the US has had the chairmanship of an important element of the OSCE this spring, in which they pushed that renewal of the Vienna document, a whole confidence building architecture. It didn't get very far. But there are real need to do this type of thing if we possibly can, both on the US-Russia front, but also on NATO-Russia, and use other mechanisms, like I said, the OSCE.
Matt, the Biden administration has been saying they don't want to reset and they don't want to escalate with Russia. In the context of arms control or anything else, how do you interpret that, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, that is precisely what the president has in mind. And as I say, there are no guarantees, but I think he's clear-eyed about that. He understands who he's dealing with here. I think one of the insights that this team has clearly drawn from Russian behavior over the last 6 years, so going back to the Obama administration even, is that in some ways, Russia is using the wreckage that it creates of this international infrastructure, be it on arms control, be it on European security, be it on what we thought were norms of espionage and cyber behavior, et cetera, to sort of force a conversation at the big boys table, at the kind of board of directors for the world, which is something that Russia has wanted for a long time. And, just as Dan is right, that it's not a reward for that bad behavior to talk about what the red lines should be and how they should be mutually transparent and enforceable. But by the same token, you have to talk. In other words, these are not problems that we're going to solve by building, endless amounts of new weapons, by browbeating the other side, or by engaging in the kind of behavior that we do within our own domestic politics, right? Which is just to make, to put as much pressure as possible on the other side. You want to go into the conversation with strength, which is why it's so smart for the administration to do the meetings with allies first, right? Doing the opposite was not an option. But you have to have the conversation, and that's the only way we have a chance of getting to some kind of understanding of what the red lines are and what happens when you cross them.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we have another question from our viewers about India, questioning two aspects of India in these conversations. First, do we really think of them as an advanced democracy? And second, do we really think of them as an advanced economy? How suited is India for joining these conversations? Perhaps I can turn to you, Abe, to talk about the democracy element, and you, Shihoko, to talk about the economic element.
Sure. Well, the democracy piece, it is a full-fledged democracy. It's a bit of a chaotic democracy. And there are certainly pieces of Indian politics that many in the West are uncomfortable with, especially when it comes to laws and policy that have been passed recently related to Muslims and immigrants. But I don't think that means India is not a democracy. I think India is the largest democracy in the world. And while it's certainly a bit of an outlier among the G7 and even compared to Japan and Australia, the fact that there's some challenges in its democracy, there's parts of it that we're not comfortable with, that we don't like, that we'd like to see different, I think doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage with them, cooperate with them, both because of our values and because of our interests.
Shihoko.
Yeah, so India is an economic powerhouse, but like it's a democracy, it can be a little bit chaotic. We've seen that it is an economic powerhouse in certain industries, especially we've seen recently that it is a big generic pharmaceutical manufacturing hub. We have seen efforts to keep India in line with the like-minded countries as a democracy. It's Asia's biggest democracy by far. There was great disappointment when India did not sign on to RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership trade framework. But efforts were made to ensure that India remained part of the discussion about keeping fair and open markets. And so we've seen Australia and Japan work together with India to cooperate on supply chain resiliency. And this initiative has really taken off since last month. And it really is to push back somewhat on overdependence on China. So when we factor in this competition with China on the economic front, India certainly has a key role to play, and its position, its status in the G7 as an observer is very much not just deserved, but warranted as well.
Excellent, thank you very much. And final question to Mike. There was an interesting comment from one of our viewers about whether the Arctic could be a zone of cooperation and peace rather than a zone of conflict. As you see us moving towards these summits, are you optimistic about how the Arctic can bring us together, or are you pessimistic that the Arctic will become, like so many other things, a contested region?
Yeah, well, I do think, that's a great question. I do think that the Arctic is a zone of cooperation. It used to be called this Arctic exceptionalism, right? Where everything else did not influence the Arctic. Well, if you think about that as a bubble, these outside issues now, Ukraine, Crimea, cyber, all of those are now pressing into that bubble a little bit. So there's a drip over. But I do not think that we're going to go to war tomorrow in the Arctic. I think that in keeping this open engagement through the Arctic Council, there's the international dialogues, that the Arctic can remain a zone of what I would call relative peace, being eyes wide open, being diligent about this, and leveraging what's happened for the last 2.5 decades through the Arctic Council and other governance mechanisms. Recall, Chris, you know full well, the Arctic is not the Wild West. It is governed. It's how we now govern it through all of the different changes that are happening because the Arctic now is part of the geopolitical landscape because of the emerging of a new ocean. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we can keep this a relatively peaceful environment for now if we manage it through dialogues, as I have suggested.
Thank you, Mike. And I think you've given us the best watchword for this discussion. eyes wide open, and we'll have our eyes wide open watching the Biden administration on its first international trip with this briefing, which I think has covered the landscape brilliantly. Dan Hamilton, Abe Denmark, Shihoko Goto, Mike Shrega, Matt Rajansky, thank you very much for excellent interventions and for briefing us so well on the topics of the many summits coming up in the next week. I also want to thank Ryan McKenna, Jason Moyer, Teresa Eder, John Tyler, Tracy Fitzgerald, Allison Ogden, and Treyan Burgess behind the scenes helping to make this all run very smoothly. Thank you very much for tuning in. We hope you'll come back to the Woodrow Wilson Center virtually for future discussions on these important topics.